What we're going to be discussing today is another one of Francis Bacon's essays. This one is titled Of Studies. Now, this is not to scare all of you students out there. This is just to let you know what Bacon thinks of studies. And of course, we're going to be discussing a lot of things related with studies, like books, etc. But before we go on with today's essay, let me first recap something of Bacon's style. As I've told you in the previous lectures also, Francis Bacon specialized in a style that was concise and pithy. So what you find in Bacon is not as many words maybe, but a lot of meaning, a lot of sense. He has different ways of conveying it. And what he's renowned for, most of all, is the terseness of his language. He doesn't use very long-winded sentences. He uses short sentences and sentences that convey a whole sea of meaning. And this you will have perceived in the previous essays, as well as in the essay that we are going to be doing today, and that is titled Of Studies. Now, the first point that Bacon presents is studies serve for delight, for ornament, and for ability. Now, he's giving you three areas: delight, ornament, and ability. And as soon as he has given this very important statement, he qualifies it and he gives a little detail about what exactly he means by delight, ornament, and ability. He goes on to say that the chief use for delight is in privateness and retiring. Now, if you remember from what I have said earlier, the way in which Bacon uses words may perhaps sound strange to you, because his use of the language is not the same language that is being used in contemporary writing or contemporary teaching. But when you get to read his essays, you realize how appropriate these words are. So as far as language use is concerned, Bacon is right at the top of all essayists. So coming back to Of Studies, he says the chief use of studies is for delight. That is, some form of entertainment, some way in which studies can contribute positively to our life. And one of the aspects that he mentions here is in privateness and retiring. Whatever you read, whatever you're studying, it is for yourself, for your private pleasure. And there is a lot of pleasure that is derived from private reading. And when I say private reading, what I am saying is reading that is done silently and for private pleasure, for the pleasure of the self. For ornament is in discourse. So as far as studies for ornament is concerned, the purpose is to beautify, to add to the apparent beauty of the language, and this is in the way that it is presented. This is in discourse. So whether you're talking about discourse in writing or discourse as used in speech, the objective is the same. It is in the way that the material is presented that you consider it an ornament. And for ability is in the judgment and disposition of business. So it depends on how you use whatever material you are studying, whatever material you are perusing, reading. The only way in which you can judge whether it is of use or not is by actually putting it to use. As he says, the disposition of business, the way in which you carry out your day-to-day affairs. So whatever you're studying is definitely going to be helpful for you when you conduct routine matters, when you conduct business matters. So you see how differently Bacon takes up this topic of studies, and the way in which he presents first an exposition of the subject. And if you go back to the very first lecture in which I discussed the different types of essays, you will remember that the expository essay is one of the most important and one of the basic types of essays. So what Bacon is using here is exposition, the technique in which he exposes a subject, defines it in great detail, and then he presents arguments for and against. So this is the same technique that he is using in the essay that is titled Of Studies. For expert men can execute and perhaps judge of particulars one by one, but the general counsels and the plots and marshalling of affairs come best from those that are learned. Now, what he is doing here is making two categories. One category is that of experts, and the other category is that of general counsels. Experts would be your subject specialists. General counsels would be those who can advise you on all routine matters of life. Here, the category that he is going to focus on is the general counsels, because experts are experts. They have command over the subject, and therefore they can give you excellent advice. But that's not the category of people that we're going to be discussing, or the category of people that Bacon is going to stress upon. The one that he is going to stress upon is the category in which you have general counsels, people who can advise you on all routine matters, even those in which they don't have expertise. Okay? So what he says is that for people who advise you on all kinds of matters, it is best to study for every subject. So if you take the example of a teacher, you could say that a teacher can teach many different subjects. And then you have an expert, a teacher who specializes in one subject, could be literature, could be linguistics, could be a subject other than English. But when you have an expert, that person is going to focus on one particular area. And yet you have teachers who could be, let's say, English teachers in a school, English teachers in a college, and maybe they're teaching subjects other than English, or maybe they're doing English literature and they're doing English language, and they're also teaching basic linguistics. So such a person would be in the position of a general counsel, would be in the position of a teacher who can advise you on subjects of literature, subjects pertaining to linguistics or ELT, and can also tell you how to correct your language, or how to develop your basic language skills. So such a person would be a general counsel. Now coming back to Bacon's essay, he says that those who are general counsels, they must prepare, they must study if they are to advise you on matters pertaining to different aspects of life. And then he gives you a very different idea. To spend too much time in studies is sloth. To use them too much for ornament is affectation. To make judgment wholly by their rules is the humor of a scholar. Now again he gives you three things. Sloth, ornament, and the humor of a scholar. So if you spend too much time, it shows that you are lazy, you're slothful, and you do not really apply yourself to the subject that is to be studied. So those of you who say that, oh, I spent 10 hours studying Bacon, you come under the category of slothful. You might spend 10 hours, but if in those 10 hours you are unable to grasp the basic concepts, then you are being slothful. So maybe if you spend 1 hour, but you focus on what you are trying to achieve, that is going to be of more benefit to you than spending 10 hours and not being able to grasp the basic concepts. All right? So if you spend too much time, you're being slothful. So don't try to convince your parents that you are the best of students because you spend 10 hours studying English literature. You need to spend quality time. So if you are focused and if you're concentrating and if you are taking in whatever you're reading, then you do not have to spend hours studying. Then a short span of time spent with concentration is going to be more beneficial than hours in which you are unable to grasp anything. So that's one aspect. The second aspect is when you use your studies to show off, as he says, for ornament, it's affectation. Now this point I would like to address particularly to students who are very fond of using big words. Instead of saying school or college or university, they'll say my alma mater. Now the common person, the layman, will not understand what you mean by alma mater. What you try to do is impress them. And that, according to Bacon, is just not to be done. So if you use your studies to impress other people, that is not a positive use of studies. And it is affected. It is definitely artificial. And even the layman can understand what is being spoken truly and what has the appearance of being very impressive but is actually artificial. So that's two categories for you. The third is to make judgment wholly by their rules, to use whatever you have studied and to make judgments on the basis of that. Now this, he says, is the choice only of a scholar. An ordinary person cannot use studies alone to make judgment. There's a lot more that is required. It's not just the knowledge that you get out of books. It's so many different things in the world which you require if you are to make correct judgment. But if you are a scholar and you want to use your studies, your learning, in order to deliver a judgment, that is acceptable. But then you have to be in the category of a scholar. And regarding scholars and studies, he says that studies perfect nature. Now here, what he is trying to present is a greater detail of the topic of studies. So he's exposing the subject in greater detail. He's bringing out different aspects of studies. He says studies perfect nature and themselves are perfected by experience. For natural abilities are like natural plants that need pruning, by study, and studies themselves do give forth directions too much at large, except they be bounded in by experience. So, what he is saying here is that studies are compulsory. Learning is compulsory. You have to read. And all you students out there who think that reading is useless, let me tell you that this is something that you will learn from experience. What you gain through reading is retained in the long term. And if you think that you watch a video or you watch a film and you will be able to remember faster, you might remember faster. But just as fast will that knowledge or information disappear from your mind if it is not supported by reading. So reading is a must. And Bacon says natural abilities are like natural plants. And natural plants, you know, are of two types. Those that grow in the wild and those that are cultivated. When a plant grows in the wild, it might be more effective, but then it will not appear as beautiful. It will not be as beneficial as a plant that has been cultivated, that has been made beautiful through pruning. That is, you use, let's say, garden shears, and you prune bushes, you give them different shapes, they look beautiful. But if you let a bush run wild, then it slowly and gradually it will take over all the land that is available and will not allow other plants to grow. So natural abilities are like natural plants, and like natural plants, natural abilities must be pruned, must be cultivated and trained to grow in a particular manner, must not be allowed to run wild. So natural abilities are pruned by studies which in themselves need experience. So the three categories that he gives here are natural abilities, studies, and experience. And the three are interdependent. You cannot rely on natural abilities alone. You cannot rely on studies alone, except if you're a scholar. You cannot rely on experience alone. These three have to be taken together. Abilities need studies in order to lend support to them, and studies need the support of experience, so that all together you get a whole that is comprehensive, beautiful, and effective. And that is the ideal combination. And then Bacon goes off on a tangent and he explains something else related to studies. He says, crafty men contemn studies, simple men admire them, wise men use them. For they teach not their own use, but that is a wisdom without them and above them, won by observation. Whatever Bacon is explaining here is explaining in threes. So he takes crafty men, simple men, and wise men. Crafty men are cunning. They're not learning oriented, but they're sly. And craftiness in the Baconian lingo is associated with cunning, with wickedness. So wicked men condemn studies. They say, oh, this is not to be done. This is useless. You don't need to read. Or they will look down on people who are studious, people who are readers, and they say, oh, so-and-so has always got his nose in a book. What does he know of the world? So crafty men condemn studies. Simple men admire them. Simple men are men who are ignorant to a great deal. They can only look at studies from afar, like you would look at the moon and say, oh, how beautiful the moon is. And you would never make an attempt to reach the moon. So that's simple men for you. Simple men, admire them. They're not like the crafty men who condemn studies. They do not have the wisdom to use studies. So they can only look at a person who is a reader or a person who is learned from a great distance and say, oh, you know, so-and-so is such a learned man. So there is a lot of appreciation, there's an admiration that some such men have for people who are studying and people who are learned, people who are scholars. And then the third category that he gives is that of the wise men. And these are the men who will use their studies. They are a breed different from the scholars in that the scholars are interested in learning for the sake of learning itself. They do not have ulterior motives. Wise men not only study, not only learn, but they also put that learning to active use. They put all their learning and all their study to positive use so that they get the maximum benefit out of them. And not only they get the maximum benefit, but they make sure that mankind in general benefits from their studies. And this category would include all those scientists, all those discoverers who have worked for the benefit of humanity. People who have discovered cures for diseases, people who have used ways and means of faster transportation, people who have worked on producing food or materials which benefit mankind. All those would be included in the category of wise men because they not only have knowledge and learning, but they also put that knowledge and learning to use, to positive use. So without putting this wisdom and this knowledge to use, it would be useless. It's just something that is out there in the space and that is not being put to use. And we come to a little Baconian advice. And this is again regarding studies. And it says, read not to contradict and confute, not to believe and take for granted, nor to find talk and discourse, but to weigh and consider. Again, he's giving you three categories. One is that of learned people who contradict and argue. The second group of people believe and take for granted, blind faith. The third, use it only for discussion. But Bacon's idea is, his point of view is, that you do none of these, but you do use your studies to weigh and consider. Whatever you learn from books, do not use it to show off, do not use it to contradict people for the sake of contradiction. Do not believe and take for granted whatever is presented to you, whatever you're reading. Do not take for granted that the written word is the true word. Don't do that. That is Bacon's advice. And don't try to show off by needless arguments, by useless discussions, but use your studies to weigh and consider. Because So once he's given you those three ideas that this is not to be done and this is what you use your studies for, he moves on to the tools that you use for studies, and the tool that Bacon deals with is the book, the written word. So the word book here stands for all forms of knowledge. You can include the e-books here. Those of you who know what a Kindle is or what a Nook is, or how you download entire books and you can read these books electronically. Those of you who have an idea of electronic material will understand what I mean when I say that anything that can be read is taken as a book, whether it is a printed version or an online or an electronic version. The idea is that the written word is the book. So then he tells you why he's made three categories out of studies. He says some books are to be tasted, others to be swallowed, and some few to be chewed and digested. Now, of course, those of you who are feeling hungry might wonder why he's using these images from the world of food and meals. But like everything else, Bacon does not leave anything to imagination, and he explains very clearly what exactly he wants you to do. So he gives you a little detail, and the slide that you can see now says some books are to be read only in parts, which is what I know a lot of you students must be doing out there, but do not do this with Bacon. With Bacon, you cannot say that only parts of Bacon's essays are to be read. You have to read the whole essay through. Others to be read but not curiously, and some few to be read wholly and with diligence and attention. Let me take you back to the previous slide. Some books are to be tasted, others to be swallowed, and some few to be chewed and digested. Books are of many different kinds. You have different categories of books, and not all of them can be read and remembered. So Bacon puts them in three categories: some to be tasted, others to be swallowed, and some few to be chewed and digested. So the majority of books, the majority of reading material falls into these two basic categories: those that are to be tasted and those that are to be swallowed. And you have a very small number of books that must be chewed and digested. So some books are important only in some areas, and so you read those areas. So some are to be read. Give everything a cursory reading, select the areas which are of special interest, and read those areas thoroughly. The second category is that of books that are to be swallowed. Read them once, forget about them. You have swallowed the entire book. You need that maybe as background information, but you do not need to see certain portions that might be important, because such a book will not have sections that are of particular importance to you. And that brings us to the third category, in which you have very, very few books. And regarding this third category, Francis Bacon says these books are to be read wholly and with diligence and attention. So that's not the kind of book that you're going to read once and forget about. This is the kind of book that you are going to read, masticate, that is chew, enjoy while you're chewing it, and give it proper attention. And that's the, now since he has brought in the concept of food, Let me take this in greater detail. The analogy that he has given you says that some books are to be tasted, some are to be swallowed, and what was the third category? Some few to be chewed and digested. The last category of food is the kind of food that while you are chewing, you enjoy the flavor, you enjoy the smell, you enjoy the sight of that food, and you enjoy the taste. The first two categories, you're only tasting or you're swallowing. You're not paying any attention to the taste. But the third category of books is definitely the category which is going to be chewed and digested, stored in the long-term memory. So when something is chewed and digested, it becomes a part of your system. It becomes a part of your bloodstream. It becomes a part of your muscles, your bones. So these few books you must read thoroughly, and you must make sure that the ideas are firmly ingrained in your mind. So the last category of books must be read wholly with diligence and attention. And then he gives a further detail of this definition, and he says some books also may be read by deputy. You know, you could give it to somebody else and say, all right, read this book, make a summary and submit the summary to me. But this is only true of less important arguments. If there is something that's really important that is being conveyed, or if you want to understand something really significant, then you must read it yourself. Then you cannot give it to a junior, an underling, and say, all right, you do it for me, make the notes, and I'll deal with the notes. You can't do that with all those books. And the meaner sort of books, so this would be the less important books. Otherwise, distilled books are like common distilled waters, flashy things. So sparkly, you know, they look very nice, but that's about it. So summaries or extracts or notes are only made for books of a material that is not of primary importance. And the reason: reading maketh a full man, conference a ready man, and writing an exact man. Now, this is one of those very frequently quoted statements of Francis Bacon. And if you remember from what I told you in the previous lectures, Francis Bacon is perhaps the one man who is most quoted, not only in the world of literature, but in the world of learning in general. And this is one of those quotes that is right up on the top of the list of very frequently quoted statements. Reading maketh a full man, conference a ready man, and writing an exact man. So when you read, you become whole. There is nothing missing from your personality. When you discuss, you become smart, you're intelligent, you know what the question is, and you definitely know what the answer is going to be. And writing is what makes an exact man. Accuracy is what you develop when you write something down. When you read, you have a lot of material. When you discuss it, you get more points. You get different people's ideas. It is when you write things down that you realize the importance of certain ideas and the relative insignificance of other ideas. So reading makes a full man, conference a ready man, and writing an exact man. All right? And therefore, if a man write little, he had need have a great memory. If he confer little, he had need have a present wit. And if he read little, he had need have much cunning to seem to know that he doth not. Again, ideas abound in Francis Bacon's essays. He has so many different angles from which he looks at the same thing that you sometimes wonder how he comes out with these ideas. So after discussing that those who read are complete, are whole, those who discuss are smart and intelligent, and those who write are very accurate and very exact, he goes on and he tells you why it is important for you to write things down. Now, you are students and you are told very frequently by your teachers that you need to write things down. If you want to remember something, write it down. And let me here emphasize this point. If you write a point down, you will remember it for a longer period of time than if you just read something. So studies are not just about reading, they are about reading, speaking and writing, and how you can use these three skills together to achieve a homogeneous whole that is your personality. So for people who don't write much, you need to have a very good memory. All right? Now, students, you need to remember this point. If you write things down, you will remember for a longer period of time. But if you rely only on what you have read, then you need to have a very sharp memory. You need to remember the written word. You have not practiced writing it down. When your hand practices writing something down, the hand remembers just as the mind does. And when you want to recall something, the hand and the mind work together with the eye, and they bring back to your memory what you might have forgotten for the time being. So for people who do not write much, you need to have a very, very sharp memory. For those who don't discuss much, Bacon says, you must have a present wit. You must be sharp. You must have a very quick repartee. Somebody says something and you have to respond at once, because that's what you've been doing, and that is what you need to be doing in order to make your point. So those who discuss little, they need to be very sharp-minded. They need to have all their concentration on what is being said, because they do not have that experience in discussion. So they need to be present mentally when something is being suggested. And those who don't read much, they need a lot of cunning. Now here Bacon makes a point that some of you might be familiar with. He says, if you do not read much, you need to be very cunning, because then you need to impress people in spite of the fact that you do not know anything about a subject. You may not know anything about a topic, but you still need to speak on it, you still need to write on it, and therefore, because you have not read much on it, you have to use your brains and come up with ideas that you may not have read about. So you need what are known as the street smarts. You need a ready wit, because you still have to impress people, you still have to converse with people and impress them. If you do not do that, you are considered a failure as a human being. So anyone who is not reading, remember, you will have to have a very present mind. You need to have very sharp faculties if you are going to survive in this world. And then he exposes the topic a little more, and he comes into histories. And Bacon says, histories make men wise, poets witty, the mathematics subtle, natural philosophy deep, moral grave, logic and rhetoric able to contend. And then he goes into a Latin phrase, but we'll go into that later. So he divides studies, he divides learning into different categories. You have history, you have poetry, you have mathematics, and then you have philosophy, you have logic and rhetoric, and you have moral or theology. So he says those who read histories are wise men. So he's definitely advocating the study of histories. And those of you out there who really want to have a good idea of what English literature is all about, I would advise you to read the history of England. The history of England is compulsory. The history of Europe is optional, which is not to say that it is not important. If you read the history of England, it will definitely help you when you are doing your history of literature. It will definitely help you when you are doing different genres and the development of the English language and literature. So history is a must. History makes men wise. Poetry makes them witty. Those of your friends who write poetry, you will see that these people are very witty. If you study the maths, it makes you very subtle. You are able to calculate things. Because you have studied math, you are very easily able to calculate what is happening, why it is happening, and what the end result is going to be, because you've been doing calculations. If you study natural philosophy, it makes you a deep person. It makes you able to have in-depth knowledge of a subject. If you have studied morals, it will make you very serious. It makes you a very serious and sober person, because you start thinking of what has gone wrong in the world, and you are also worried on how it can be set right. Logic and rhetoric allow you to discuss. They allow you to hold your own and to be very good speakers. And all this, Bacon says, is because studies are transformed into character. The Latin phrase that he's given, abunt studia in mores, means in English, studies are transformed into character. Whatever you're studying, that is what is going to dictate your character. Whatever you read will finally and ultimately show you the path that your life will take. So studies are transformed into character, and therefore whatever you're studying, your temperament, your nature is going to be decided by that. And then he goes on to say, there is no stone or impediment in the wit, but may be wrought out by fit studies, like as diseases of the body may have appropriate exercises. So then he makes a further case for studies, for reading, and he says, there is nothing wrong with the character or temperament of a man which cannot be improved by studies. And he makes a comparison with a body that is diseased, and he says, just as a person who is ill can always be cured by some form of treatment, in the same way a mind that is diseased can always be cured by studying or by reading material which is relevant to a particular field. And he's given you the fields already. Remember, history, poetry, mathematics, philosophy, logic, rhetoric, and theology. These are the basic branches of knowledge that he has discussed, and he says that there is no problem that human beings may have which learning cannot cure. Just as there is no disease in the human body that cannot be cured by a particular form of treatment. Now, how that happens, Bacon is going to tell you. So he says, bowling is good for the stone and reins, shooting for the lungs and breast, gentle walking for the stomach, riding for the head, and the like. And there are so many other problems that human beings might have, and there are so many different kinds of exercises that you can do in order to cure these different problems or different ills of the human body. So bowling is good for the stone. The posture that you admit when you are bowling, he says, is good if you have stones in the gallbladder or kidney. Shooting is good for the lungs, because when you shoot, you fill your lungs with air and then you exhale. So your lungs are exercised when you are shooting with a bow and arrow, and you know it takes a lot of strength to shoot an arrow from a bow. Gentle walking, everybody is recommended gentle walking because they say that it's good for your general well-being, and it is particularly good for the stomach. So those of you who have digestion problems, Francis Bacon's advice is walk. Riding is good for the head. That motion is, according to Bacon, is good for keeping a clear brain. It's also good because when you're riding, you're out in the countryside, and it's not just the exercise that you get, it's the fresh air that you breathe, which is good and which clears the head of all its cobwebs, and which also gives you good ideas. All right? So if a man's wit be wandering, let him study the mathematics, for in demonstrations, if his wit be called away, never so little, he must begin again. So those of you who have problem remembering things, you have to do mathematical problems, because when you're calculating, Bacon says that that is very good exercise for you. If his wit be not apt to distinguish or find differences, let him study the schoolmen, for they are splitters of hairs. Now here he's speaking not very positively of educators, and he says if you can't find a difference between two objects or two events or two situations, then you need to study the educators, the schoolmen, because educators, and here you can see Francis Bacon getting a gentle dig at teachers in general when he says that teachers split hairs. So if you have someone who is, let's say, pronouncing the word as the British pronounce it, the teacher might say, oh, that's wrong pronunciation. This is how it is pronounced in contemporary English, and that might be an American pronunciation, which does not mean that standard English pronunciation is wrong. But if you have a teacher who likes to split hairs or who likes to disagree with everything that students say, then you have the kind of person who will give you reasons for everything, reasons for disagreement, reasons for something that you would not think has any reason. So he says that if you are unable to find differences, study a teacher's words. Study the way a teacher behaves. Study what a teacher has written. So not a very positive viewpoint of us teachers, but that is how Bacon deals with this subject. So if he be not apt to beat over matters and to call up one thing to prove and illustrate another, let him study the lawyer's cases. So if you have a person who doesn't really have any experience in argument or in presenting both sides of a situation, that kind of a person must read law cases, because law cases provide both sides of the argument, and law cases are very good practice if you want to have the argument for law cases, therefore, are very good practice if you want to debate a subject, if you want to present both sides of the argument. So Bacon advocates reading up lawyers' cases for people who are unable to give arguments in favor and against a situation. So every defect of the mind may have a special receipt. So every problem has a solution. According to Bacon, there is nothing that does not have a solution. Now, before we wind up, let us quickly go through the different aspects of studies that we have covered today. If you remember, from what I showed you in the first slide, Bacon discusses the subject of studies very thoroughly, and then he goes on to discuss different types of studies. He takes you on to books, he discusses the different kinds of books, and then he discusses how reading makes a full man, conference makes a ready man, and writing is compulsory if you want to be accurate and exact. So all these aspects Bacon discusses, because this is basically an expository essay, and in an expository essay you have to deal with all possible aspects of a case. So when he takes up the case of studies, he brings reading into it, he brings books into it, and he discusses the different types of books, and he also tells you that there are some books that are only to be tasted, others that are to be swallowed whole, that is, they're not important enough to be enjoyed, but you must use them for reference, for background material. And then there are very few books that need to be chewed and digested. So those of you who are fond of reading will be familiar with this kind of a situation. Sometimes you pick up a book and you say, oh, it looks interesting, I need to know what the ending is. And so you quickly thumb through the pages, you go to the ending and you say, oh, so that was it, finished. That's a book over and done with. And then you have a book which you think is compulsory for you to read because the teacher has recommended it, because it is background reading. And for those who are really interested in studying literature, I would strongly advise a good history of England or history of Europe, And that's the kind of book that you can say is to be swallowed, because that's background information. It's reference material that will provide you with the political scenario, that will give you the overall scene in which writers were creating literature at different points in England. So you will have a very good idea of the historical, political, religious, financial and economic situation when you read the history of England. So he goes on from books to different types of studies, and then he says that there are different branches of knowledge, and Bacon also gives you with the different branches of knowledge the different types of minds that you will be able to develop if you are keenly studying one particular aspect or one particular branch of knowledge. And he divides knowledge into different categories. He gives you history, he gives you philosophy, he gives you poetry, mathematics, rhetoric, theology, all these branches of knowledge which were prevalent or which were given importance in his times. Bacon deals with them one by one, and he tells you what kind of a mind you need in order to study this particular branch of knowledge, and how your mind will develop when you study one particular branch of knowledge. And he concludes by giving you very good advice on the kind of subjects that you must study if you want to excel in life. And he's talking about life in general, but he also speaks of particular types of life or particular instances in your life when you can use your knowledge of a subject to maximum effect. And he doesn't just focus on book knowledge. He says books are a good way of making a personality into a complete whole. And he gives you examples, and then he goes on to say that books are not the only thing. He first gives an example of how natural ability is like a natural plant, and then he discusses this further and says that it's not only books that you need, you also need experience. So you have a complete whole that is developed from your natural abilities, and which is further assisted by your study of a subject, which gives you knowledge in that subject, plus experience. So natural ability, knowledge, and experience. These three will make a whole personality, will make a very rounded human being. They will help to develop into the best possible personality. And I'm sure you will appreciate the excellent advice that Bacon has given all of us in this essay of studies. You are students, I am a teacher. Both of us realize the importance of studies. If we did not realize the importance of studies, neither would I be sitting here delivering this lecture, nor would you be sitting there following this lecture online. Thank you very much for being patient today, and I hope that you have enjoyed this lecture. We'll meet again with one more aspect of life that Francis Bacon has discussed. Thank you, and Allah Hafiz.